please feel free to ask. A reminder, we have a door prize drawing, and the prize for today will be a UMR t-shirt. So if you haven't done so already, please sign in for our door prize. Next week, continuing with the theme of public safety, we will have Detective Michael Ransfranz from the Olmsted County Sheriff's Office of Minnesota Internet Crimes Against Children Task Force and Mark Peterson from the Rochester Police Department investigator to present on keeping our children and grandchildren safe on the internet. But for tonight, I am pleased to introduce Mark Erickson and Steve Borchardt. Mark Erickson is a retiree of the law enforcement since 2013. He had worked in the investigations, training, civil and warrants, and courtroom security as a sergeant and captain, and was the commander of the Southeast Minnesota Narcotics and Gang Task Force. His experience includes being a RCTC skills instructor since 1999 and an adjunct instructor. His past work experience for the college includes use of force instruction in chemical agent, PPCT management systems, basic and advanced firearms training, high-risk stops, as well as crime scene investigation. Steve is a retired Olmsted County Sheriff, having served from 1991 to 2008. He currently works for the Rochester Area Foundation. So please welcome Mark and Steve.
As she noted, I had the honor of serving as sheriff from 1991 to 2008, and then I did some consulting for the state of Minnesota on a public safety communications program until 2014, and then somewhere in there, I found my way to Rochester Area Foundation, and they offered me a position, so I've been doing development work, fundraising work for them, and just at the beginning of this year, I moved in a new position doing housing work for them. You may recall they have a program called First Homes, and that housing, workforce price housing project is about to start up again in our community. Well, how did I get here? Well, I was appointed with Ann. Where did Ann go? And there she is, right back there. And in a previous life, she taught me how to lose weight. At one point in my tenure as your sheriff, when I had gotten a little too portly, and I went to a class she taught me how to be skinnier. And I've stayed mostly that way since then. But in any event, she called up one day and wanted to talk about UMR Connection. So I've been helping with that advisory board a little bit. And the question came up, what are some topics that would be of interest to our community? And as you all are aware, use of force, particularly use of deadly force in police work, has been in the media in a big way in the last 18 months. And our law enforcement officers are being challenged to defend the way they do business and why they make the decisions they make on a regular basis, and to an extent that we haven't seen in the last 25 years. And so it occurred to me that folks may not realize how much science goes into the business of teaching how to use deadly force and when to use deadly force and when it's legal and how it's not, and how it all goes down when you're out on the street. So I asked Mark if he would participate in this. I had the honor of serving with Mark for a good share of our career, and he concluded his career in the Olmsted County Sheriff's Office as a captain, which is a third in command, a lofty position and a distinguished position to arrive at in a law enforcement career at the local level. And now he teaches at the RCTC program, which has become one of the very strongest programs in the state relative to making new police and officers and sheriffs deputies across the state. And they are on the cutting edge of some of the best instruction that's going on. And as one of their lead instructors, I knew he'd be an outstanding resource for this. So I asked him if he would put together a program that would kind of chronicle the history of the teaching of use of force, particularly use of deadly force, from the beginning of my career in 1975 through the present day, because you'll see there's been some remarkable changes that have taken place. What we don't want to come off as it is, we don't want to come off as defensive. We want to come off as imparting information about how this teaching is done. You may note You may have heard in the news in the last few days that the Police Executive Research Forum, otherwise known as PERF, and the International Chiefs of Police released a document of 30 strategies to reform the use of force and deadly force. And we have familiarized ourselves with those recommendations. You would be interested to know that many of those things we implemented here in Olmsted County and Rochester over a decade ago. And that's not to be boastful, but that's simply to point out that our policing in the United States of America is accomplished by local police. We have federal police relative to the Secret Service and the FBI, but frontline policing services are provided by local police departments and sheriff's offices that are free to instruct the way as they see fit to a certain extent. Now, there are state standards and there are industry standards, but a local organization in Olmsted County or Rochester, Minnesota, can be way ahead of a major policing agency in a major metropolitan area relative to philosophies and techniques. And that's probably different in this nation compared to a lot of other places. So with that, I'm going to sit down and I'm going to let Mark talk to you about what they teach and why they teach it. And from time to time, I'll jump up and intervene because I can't help myself. We hope to come away with an understanding of how this is taught and that it's not, it is a very specific and science data-based approach to how you use force, particularly deadly force, in law enforcement encounters. I told you I'd be really brief.
Thank you. Well, yeah, if you know the sheriff, that takes some work. That takes some work. So if I'm a little bit nervous today, it's because somebody that sat on an interview panel when I was a young deputy, and I made some comment about his son George. I know a George, and he's a real fun guy. And then as I'm saying, it dawned on me, it's probably his son, and now I've made a fool of myself. So, but that was interesting. But really, truly, people, think about law enforcement right now. There's really no other area in our society that's scrutinized so much as the use of force. And some of the current cases that we have out there, Ferguson, Missouri, Michael Brown. Now, throughout many of our communities, and that's not what we're doing tonight, but they were talking about educating their public and their city commissioners and county commissioners about use of force and law enforcement involvement and why we do what we do. And they were just a little bit behind the curve on that, and they didn't get it done. But that probably would have helped things out there a little bit. Staten Island, New York, Eric Gardner, that was out there. He was a big man selling cigarettes, I guess illegally, is what they're saying. And in the newspaper and on the media, they talked about him being choked. Well, I think they found later on that it's not a chokehold, but I think that's what New York calls it. It's actually a vascular neck restraint, but they call it a chokehold. But we can talk about maybe later on, we'll talk about maybe what happened to him there. In Baltimore, Freddie Gray, Cleveland, Ohio, Tamron Rice, a 12-year-old. Now this case in Cleveland was just in the news. And they cleared the officers of any wrongdoing. Now, that shocked a lot of people, but there was a lot of things in the works why that happened. Part of it was the dispatchers getting the information and distributing that information. The officers didn't know that the complainant had said, it looks like a young man. The officers didn't know that it might not have been a real gun. I don't know tactically if the officers knew where that young man was in that park or if that young man moved. But I did see the video when they drove up, and they are right on top of that young man. And they get out of the car and they got a gun pointed at them. I know from our training, the training I give my officers, there's only one way that we react to that. If we think that we have deadly force, situation where it's our life, and we're an opportunity that we're going to use deadly force, we're going to react that way. It gets to because of your training. It's a reaction. It's not something you think about a great deal. So we have that out there. We also have locally, Minneapolis, Jamar Clark. They're still trying to, that's still part of an active investigation. And there's people out there that says there's some video out there that they want that released. and hopefully we get that release. But as part of being an investigator and captain of investigations, I know that we don't want that video released until our criminal investigation is done. If we had issues in Olmsted County regarding any of our officers, we gave it to another agency. If Rochester Police Department had an issue with one of their officers, they gave it to another agency. In this case in Minneapolis, I believe the BCA, Bureau of Criminal Apprehension, is investigating it. So they have given it to another agency to follow up on. So you think of the frequency of the use of force, guys, and I don't want to think I'm making less or belittling the issues we have out there right now, but just to be aware of it, 1% of the encounters with police officers involve the use of force, just 1%, just 1%. And 80% of those arrests involve use of weaponless tactics. And you think of our tactics, maybe a baton, expandable baton, or a taser, or a chemical, something like that. So only 20% of our arrests involve something like that. So it lets you to think that maybe there's not a problem out there. I would suggest that if our problem, or if our communities don't trust us, then we got a problem. So Washington Post, and this just came out within the last 6 weeks, I believe. I pulled it off. The Washington Post did an investigation of nearly 1,000 firearm deaths at the hands of law enforcement in 2015. This is about as current as you can get. So law enforcement, we don't keep stats of that. Now, if somebody else gets robberies, homicides, rapes, we collect that data and we send it to the federal government to keep track of. But officer-involved shootings, law enforcement doesn't keep track of that data, and maybe that should change. But so Washington Post went out and they researched. They went to the newspapers and they went to the media outlets and they're trying to figure this out. And what they found is a great majority of the people who die at the hands of police fit into at least one of three categories. They were wielding a weapon, they were suicidal, mentally troubled, or they ran from officers. So that's good information. That might, going forward, that might help us when we're training our new recruits or in-service training for old recruits. So many times I talk about the mentally ill. We're not only we're dealing with people who are mentally ill, but sometimes the people are physiologically, metabolically compromised. So what I'm going to talk about a little bit in a few minutes, some people that have excited delirium. They're subject to pre-existing conditions. So if we wrestle them, they could die. If we spray them with a chemical agent, they could die. If we tase them, they could die. Okay? So we got to be able to recognize that. And in many parts throughout the country, we have. And we went to our first responders so that they know when they come how to treat these people because they're sick and they need to get to the ER. So here we have it, excited delirium. And I want you to think about excited delirium, superhuman strength, bizarre behavior. The obvious one is the guy walking down the street nude with a big machete. He's certainly in crisis. That's the obvious one, people. That's somebody that could be suffering from excited delirium. So we can figure that out in short order. But there's a lot of people that aren't quite there. They aren't nude. They aren't carrying that machete. And they're suffering from excited delirium. And it's difficult many times for law enforcement, and it's difficult for our first responders, people that work for places like Gold Cross Ambulance, to be able to identify that. So, but there is drugs that we can give them. We can get them to the hospital, we can treat them, and we can save them. Next one we have down here, positional asphyxia. I think about Eric Gardner in New York. Now, when they did the autopsy, they said there was no damage to his throat. The chokehold did not kill him. Okay, and there's arguments on both sides of this with positional asphyxia right now. If you handcuff somebody and you maybe hobble, tie their legs, and you lay them down, that they're in a position they can't breathe. Well, there's a lot of evidence out there right now saying that's not the only deal. There's got to be something else. So in Eric Gardner's place, he was diabetic. If you had diabetes, your circulation slows down in your body. And that's one of the reasons you suffer from heart disease and strokes. He had high blood pressure. He was overweight. And in this given circumstance, he got choked. He had not only that officer's body on him, but a couple other officers' body on him. Now, exactly what the coroner is going to say in that, but as a training officer looking at that, I'm thinking about, is positional asphyxia in that type of case something that could have happened? And how are we going to address that as officers? And it might be getting an ambulance crew right away and identifying it. It might be in a position where that respirations or something like that would be in order. Because in this case, I'm not sure what it was, a gross misdemeanor or if it was a felony level offense, but it wasn't active, it was maybe active resistance. He's pushing off and backing up and putting his hands up. He's not like actively aggressive towards the officers. So kind of going to the history of law enforcement, when I first got started, now I graduated in high school from 1975, and the sheriff got started. So I went to school a couple of years at RCTC, where I'm working now, and decided I'm not smart enough. So I went on to Mankato State and got a Bachelor of Science degree in law enforcement. So I started my law enforcement career in 1980. At that time, it just was kind of evolving for us, or for me, or I would say a lot of officers like Sheriff Borchardt, where we were going from a .38 or .357 revolver on our side in a big flashlight. And that big flashlight was our alternate use of force. Okay? So it was within a few years, Sheriff Borchardt is sending I and another officer to the cities, to the BCA Use of Force School, where we got trained in baton use, expandable baton use, and chemical agent training. Now, right out there, you hear people saying mace. Well, we don't use mace because mace kills people. We have a combination of chemicals, and you're thinking cayenne pepper, something like that. Now, I'm not going to fool you and try to tell you that it's not uncomfortable. I mean, it's uncomfortable. Your eyes burn, copious amounts of mucous membrane fall from your nose. So if you got a bad cold, we don't charge you any extra for treating that. But we just didn't have a lot. And I want you to think about who we are as a nation. Now, many of us, our ancestors, came over from England. And our founding fathers sat down and they were going to write the Constitution. The Constitution was about protecting us from our government, because of the way things were going on in England at the time, the government and the church. So you could argue that, not a lot of trust for law enforcement just coming out of the chute. And then you think about some of our own history. And I remember as a young man watching the civil rights movements in the South. I remember as a young man, maybe because of my father's influence, watching the way they were treated when they came to Chicago. Not so nice. So we've had a history that we've dealt with for a long time. Now think of our new immigrants. My wife tells a story about a young lady that was like student exchange coming here from South America somewhere, living with a family. And she had a young lady that was her age living with her. And she was driving to school one day, her car broke down. She pulled off to the side of the road, called her dad, said, I need a tow. And he said, well, I'll get you and take you to school. She says, wait a minute, a cop just pulled up behind me, Rochester City cop. She says, I just called my dad, he's going to send a tow, can I get a ride to school? He says, sure. Dad, I'm going to get a ride from the cop. So he takes her to school, drops her off. So the exchange student says, what? I can't believe you did that. You're lucky he didn't take you out in the country and rape you and kill you. So that's what they know from their country. So we have new immigrants that don't have a lot of trust in law enforcement. And you take a look at our cases out there that is tying up all the media time, that's not going to develop a lot of trust in the community. So that's some of the issues that we're having as a society too. I talked about not having a lot of different things. Right now in law enforcement, again, we're looking at how we're doing traffic stops, checking buildings, dealing with barricade suspects, active shooters. You think about some of the things that happened out in Colorado where the officers get there and there's an active shooter going on inside the building. They wait for the SWAT team to come because that was the way we did things. Now, and we didn't train inside of the schools. Now Sheriff Torgerson can tell you that we go to the schools. We have active shooter training with the students in the schools. My wife is a para in the Rochester School District. She has 3 and 4-year-olds. They have active shooter training. They know to go against the wall, go down on their knees and cover their heads with their hand, and they know to be quiet. And she says, one time during the day, they're quiet, that's the only time. We can't get them to settle down for anything else, but she says it's like they know. It's like they know they're supposed to do it. Incredible. So we're changing. We're changing how we do things all the time. And dealing with protesters. IPC. Now this is something that Sheriff Borchardt implemented a long time ago and we've continued to work with. Interpersonal communication. Now and I think you're going to see this more throughout the country and throughout the state of Minnesota. This year, I'm a new director or coordinator of the Law Enforcement Skills Program at RCTC. This year I implemented a 12-hour class. You could probably say 12 hours, it should be more. Yeah, it probably should be. 12 hours on interpersonal communication, how to talk to people, how to deal with people. I have an advisory board of local law enforcement people from southeastern Minnesota, sheriffs, chiefs of police from the different agencies, and they say, you guys come out of here, they know how to do everything, but they don't know how to talk to people. So we're working on that. And then CIT training, Crisis Intervention Team is what it stands for, or training. Recognizing people that are suffering from mental health issues. You know, remember one of the slides, the 3 classes of people we're dealing with? People with mental health issues. Recognize that and having the ability to talk to them. Be able to maybe calm them down. Have them comply with you. Okay? So we're looking at doing that. We always kind of went by a use of force continuum. And that kind of guides us. It's supposed to guide the courts about what force we use. And we look at for officer subject factors. And what we mean by that, I'm 5'8", 145. I would say I got a bad back, but since I got my new hip, my back is pretty good. But I certainly have limitations. Now, I might be able to talk some young man out of a fight. I got that going for me. But we also look at the subject factors on the person that we're dealing with. Most of the people we deal with are like 18 to 24 years old, maybe 26 years old. And most of the time it's men. Okay? So we're looking at their size and things. And now granted, we have some skill level, we have some tools, the taser, chemical, things like that we can use in the use of force encounter. So we look at that. The one thing, and I want you guys to think back about that 1%, many times, officer presence. We come into a room with our uniform on, and it's a sense of control. People behave differently when there's somebody with a uniform on, except for when the sheriff's back there. I act any differently. He's known me to be a loudmouth my entire life. So, but we do. I think about, driving down the road and you see a squad car, you take your foot off the gas. You might be driving 25 and a 30, but you take your foot off the gas. So really, truly, our command presence just works for us. You put us in uniform. There's a lot of respect in southern Minnesota for law enforcement, and we have that command presence. Verbal commands. I don't know how many times that I arrested somebody that I had to put hands on. Usually it was, sir, you're under arrest. Turn around, put your hands behind your back. And I put the handcuffs on. It was very rare that I had to do anything more than that. Now, I was pretty early into my career, like 86, that I got a taser, or not a taser, chemical, an expandable baton. Okay, and I always had a gun. So, and I was a reserve for 2 years before I got on full time. So 31 years carrying a firearm, how many people did I shoot at? 0. How many people besides other law enforcement people, other cops, did I spray with chemical? 1. 1 person. And then never used my expandable baton on anybody. And that person, the sheriff was with me. And he was a mentally ill person. And he said, we took him to the hospital, we took him to General to St. Mary's, and he told the officers, next time you won't take me alive. Next time I'll have a gun, and you'll have to shoot me. So we put ourselves in a position that we didn't have to use deadly force. I had a bunker that catches bullets. It's got a clear screen there, and I had a door jamb I hid behind. Now the sheriff had a weapon, a lethal weapon over the top of me, and I had chemical. So when the gentleman come around the corner at me, I sprayed him. And he went right down. So you could argue we could have used deadly force in that situation, but we put ourselves in a position that we didn't have to. We didn't have to. And that happens more often, quite honestly, more often than you think, or more often than not. So PPCT. Now I want to give credit to some of the people I'm getting this information from, because PPCT, Pressure Points and Control Tactics. It's a use of force curriculum that we teach our students at RCTC. And I get a lot of my information out of there. Dr. Bill Lewinsky, he's from Force Science Research, and he's out of Mankato State College. But they are worldwide, and they have doctors and law enforcement from all over the world that are part of this group. So I get a lot of information from them. But empty hand submission technique. So we're talking about wrist locks. So if I grab somebody and says, sir, you're under arrest, I might blanket their elbow, go down to their wrist, and they generally come along with me. But if they don't, I can do a knee strike to their peroneal nerve and put them in a wrist lock. And that's all it takes. Now for me, that's more than what it would take. I don't like that. Okay, but so that's all it takes. Then we talk about hard control techniques, aggressive response, kicks, punches, stuns, use of aerosol. Now this is about your agency, where you want to put like chemical agent or a taser, where you want to put it in the continuum, where you want your officers to use it. If I've got some young officer that female that's 110 pounds as an officer, and somebody is 6'2", 240, she might not want to go in and go hands-on. If she grabs a hold of an arm or a wrist and say, you're under arrest, come this way, and he pulls away, she might go to chemical. She doesn't have to try to take him down. It's not practical for her to do that. Okay, so again, you can put in hard control techniques, you could put chemical, and I think you could even put taser, depending on your department. Intermediate weapons, expandable baton, pepper spray, again, taser, beanbag rounds. Well, we did that here with ERU, or our SWAT team, one time, where I had a gentleman that I think he probably wanted to commit suicide by cop, but we put ourselves in a position, and it was a Rochester City officer, that he used a beanbag load. Now this guy had I don't remember if he had a rifle or a shotgun, but he had a long gun. But because we were in a position to cover, we were able to use that beanbag round. Now, I'm not suggesting that that's the catch-all. I don't know how many of you people lost a family member. I lost a father when I was in 8th grade, and I lost a son when he was 4 years old. I'm not suggesting that any of our officers put themselves in a situation that they're going to leave their family. That's not what I'm suggesting. I'm just saying that with training, scenario-based training, we have other alternatives, and sometimes we can make it work, and many times our officers try that. And then lethal force. So lethal force, and I tell my students this, just...
Cold water.
How about cold water? I'm not sure that wouldn't work today. Many times, and I think they have used that in scenarios or situations.
They've chemical and everything, and cool.
That's, well, and I tell you what, in certain situations, if we're not blasting them over with fire hoses or something like that, it might be appropriate. Lethal force, deadly force situations, I tell my students, I tell other officers, we shoot for center mass. In these volatile situations, you're not in a position that you can shoot a gun out of an arm or something like that. It's too fluid, it's too dynamic, you just can't do it. So we shoot for center mass. Most officers have a hard time doing that. Lieutenant Colonel David Grossman, he talks a lot. He's written a couple of books on killing. And he says in many wars, officers or soldiers weren't cowards, but only about 20% would actually shoot at the enemy. The others, they weren't cowards. They would run across and grab their buddy and drag him away, and they would reload their guns, but they wouldn't actually shoot at the enemy. So I tell so it's difficult to get an officer actually to point their gun at somebody and shoot them. I tell them it's force that we're using. It's a high probability of causing death and could cause death. But we live in Rochester. We can get them to St. Mary's. They can save them. And I said, that works two ways, guys. If we get shot, they can get us to St. Mary's maybe even quicker. Okay, so we can get saved. So it works both ways. Works both ways. So Steve, you want to talk some about the history here?
Slides aren't as uniform as they might have been. Apologize for that. What am I doing with this?
I can do it. Tell me when you're done.
All right. We haven't done this presentation before, so this is, we're just... So, Mark talked to you about the continuum of force, all the way from presence up to deadly force. A couple of things he might have mentioned, but there's a lot to mention in this process. When the officer is using deadly force, he said they shoot for center mass. It doesn't mean they are necessarily shooting to kill. That is an old term that we used to use. What we're doing is shooting to stop the violence. It's not our intent to try to kill, it's our intent to try to stop the violence and to do what it takes to do that. Now, one of the more controversial things you've seen just lately that's been criticized is that when officers have shot someone and they're laying there, they run up and put the handcuffs on them and then back off and don't treat them. And that has come under some scrutiny. And that is the result of some training in some programs that have taught that on some circumstances, when somebody has been shot and thought to be disabled, and officers then quit paying attention to them because they thought they were down and disabled, and it turns out they weren't, and they were able to renew the assault. Because of those kinds of cases, the instructors, largely nationwide, have been instructing officers, even though they've shot them, run up, put handcuffs on, and back off. Well, that's being rethought. We've never taught that I'm aware of in our offices here in Olmsted County, but that's one of the things that is sending a real bad message at this present time that's being rethought. That when you do shoot somebody, certainly you need to protect your safety, but then you need to treat them as quickly as possible and as practical. So what these slides depict here is the 1970s. That's when I started. So how did we teach use of force in 1975 when I came on the Olmsted County Sheriff's Office? And to do just a little demonstration, we had a 38 caliber revolver. Some guys carried a 357 revolver. But there were 6 rounds that went in a revolving cylinder, and we were taught to stand still with our arm out and sight down our arm and shoot like this. We were just starting to use something that was known as combat shooting stance, which was a wide base and arm straight out shooting like that. But many of the officers in 1975 that were older still went to the range once a year to prove that they knew which direction, which end of the gun to stand behind, and that they could put bullets in a target from about 20 yards away. That was the extent of the use of force training. We had some chemical on our belt. It was called tear gas. And then some officers carried something called a SAP, some of the older gentlemen may understand what that was, but it was a piece of lead in the end of a leather apparatus that you carry in your back pocket, and you struck somebody with it. So when you struck somebody with that piece of lead, it was a pain compliance kind of tool that would hurt. So hopefully the bad guy would get sick of hurting, so they'd start complying with what you wanted to do, or you'd hit him some more. But it was really a pretty primitive kind of tool, and that was it. You might have had a shotgun in the car, but that was it. That was the training that was done. Now fast forward into the 80s, it was largely the same, except that we were starting to learn that we needed to have other kinds of alternatives at our disposal. So the gas became higher tech. It became freeze or pepper spray, which was an easier, or it was a more effective tool in the street. And also we were all now shooting combat style, and hardly anybody was shooting like this, but really that was about all the change. But keep in mind, at that point in time, the average police officer's shooting situation was a distance of 3 to 5 feet. So me to you, 2 to 3 rounds with both parties being stationary. That was the average police shooting situation. So you can imagine a domestic disturbance, a traffic stop, where the officer came up to the car and all of a sudden they were confronted by a gun. It was that close. It was that immediate. And we were also taught in that day and age that you didn't pull your gun out and point it at somebody until you were looking at a gun being pointed at you. So when I would approach a car in 1977, I might walk up and we didn't have what became known as retention holsters, which were holsters that have a spring-loaded apparatus in them that make it difficult to pull the gun out unless you're the operator of the gun and have been trained on how to operate it. We didn't have those. We had a little snap on top, and when we approached the car, I might reach up and put my hand somewhere close, but I didn't want to look like I was being too aggressive because that was frowned on. And I really wasn't authorized to pull it out and point it at anybody unless I was looking at a gun. So that's important for later, so hang on to that thought. We got into the 80s and really didn't have much change. About 1990 is when they came up with this thing called the continuum of force that Mark talked about. And that's when we started thinking about force more scientifically, from presence, through verbal, through hands-on, through intermediate tools like gas or eventually taser. At that time we were still dealing with stun guns, which was a pain compliance mechanism. I'm going to shock you and it's going to hurt, so you'll start complying. And then off until deadly force. We got into that continuum process through the 90s then. We became a little bit more sophisticated. The other thing that had happened in the 80s is you all recall in the 70s that we had a lot of bag holdups with hostage situations. Remember? And we talked about the Stockholm syndrome, about hostages that would start to side with their the person taking the captive. Well, what happened as a result of that is a lot of officers ran into those situations and ended up getting killed or causing other people to get killed. So we developed what we called SWAT teams, special weapons and tactics. And that we started teaching officers in the 80s that the first arriving officers back off, form a perimeter to contain the activity, and wait for the fancy guys with the special weapons and special tactics to arrive, and then they go in and do everything. So that's how it progressed through the 90s. Now, we got a little bit better through the early 90s with our force continuum, and then in the mid-90s, we started learning more about intermediate force tools. It became apparent that particularly dealing with people in mental health crisis, we had to have a better tool than simply hitting them with something, spraying them with something, or shooting them dead. We had to have something in the middle. And that's when we started to see the advent of beanbag rounds. It's a round that's shot out of a shotgun. And pepper spray that is projected in a paintball kind of apparatus. So rather than putting paint in a paintball, there's pepper spray in it, and you can shoot it out of a paintball gun. And what else did we have? Paintball, beanbags, and then towards the end of the 1990s, we started to see the taser. A taser is still referred to by some people as a stun gun, but that's not what it is. It uses an electrical current, but what it does is overrides your neuromuscular system. You have a system of nerves in your body, and that system of nerves can conduct one electrical input at a time. And you get hit with a stun gun or a taser, and it introduces another electrical current onto that same system of nerves, and it overrides the electrical current that your nerves are operating in, and all of a sudden you don't have control of your body. So you flop around, you lay on the floor. And then the officer is able to come in while you're incapacitated and put the cuffs on you and take you under control. That's under ideal circumstances. So those tools all came about during the course of the 90s. But then something happened right at the end of the 90s, and I don't know how I'm doing with the slides.
I got you on 90s. We're on the 90s.
What happened in the end of 1990s, and I know you all remember it, it happened at Columbine High School in Colorado. And there were active shooters in the school killing kids when the first officers arrived. And the first couple officers tried to storm the school and get in and engage, but they were beaten back, and all the other officers did what they've been told for 15 years. They arrived and they formed a perimeter and waited for the fancy guys with the special weapons and tactics to roll up. And sure as the world, they rolled up a half an hour later, and then they all held a little confab outside where they could draw on their whiteboards and figure out how they're going to assault this school. And by the time they got inside, everybody was dead, including the bad guys. They hadn't saved a single life. And I was your sheriff at that point in time, and I was involved with the National Sheriff's Association, and I had the opportunity to have a personal class by the sheriff of the county that Columbine was located in, and we all said as a profession, we got to do better. We got to figure out how we're going to engage when the activity is going on. That changed the paradigm of how we teach officers to engage an active shooter totally and completely. Because for the previous 15 years, every young officer that had come on the scene, we had come into the job, we had taught them that if you get called to an active shooter situation, you form a perimeter and call the fancy guys with the special equipment and tactics. Or if you accidentally find yourself being shot at, the first thing you do is dive for cover. And then you think about returning fire or whatever else it takes. Now, as of 2000, we're teaching officers, no, you have to go in that school. You have to go into that domestic. Whatever it is where that active shooter is happening, you have to go in. Which means that you may have to form yourself into a team, 4 people in a diamond, one person walking backwards, one person walking forward, and if the shooter comes towards you and starts shooting, you don't dive for cover because you'll expose the back of the person behind you in the diamond. You have to stand in there and engage and shoot. A totally different training situation. And also what it evolved by this time is we no longer had the average shooting situation as being 3 to 5 feet, 2 to 3 rounds. Now, due to a lot of different forces that had taken place across the country relative to the kinds of weapons the criminals had and the way that they were conducting themselves, now the average shooting situation was a distance of 10 to 15 yards moving laterally. So where we had taught people for the previous 25 years to shoot like this or like this, now we're having to teach them to gain target acquisition early in the encounter and to maintain target acquisition as they move laterally. So the implications for a training program was now we couldn't be on a firing range in the classic sense that you've all seen the firing range in your mind. Now we had to go out to a quarry, or we had to have a facility that had berms all around it and had freedom of movement where we could park a car in the middle of it to do real-life scenario training. And we had to teach these officers how to move from room to room with the gun out and target acquisition and their eyeball going down that barrel, always being ready to fire. What kind of situations that put an officer in? It's a lot easier to fire from right up here than it is from walking around with your gun in your holster, like I was trained. This is a good thing. This can save some officers' lives. and can also cause officers to shoot earlier than they might have otherwise shot. So that's what started happening in the early 2000s. Mark talked about Dr. Lewinsky at the Force Institute at Mankato State University. And now I'm going to turn it back to him in just a second. He's going to talk about some of the research that Dr. Lewinsky conducted. But to bring my part of this to conclusion, all the way from where I started in 1975, keep in mind, some of the research that I just summarized that Dr. Lewinsky discovered is with a group of students that didn't know firearms, didn't know guns. They were able to give them a handgun and have them stand at the gun at their side and at a signal in their own head, not a signal they were given, but when they chose to bring that gun up and fire it. And what they learned is it took 1/2 a second from the time that that gun was down by their side to the time it was up and firing. And they could be accurate at 10 feet to an upper body shot 80% of the time. What they also learned is that if you are an officer or anybody else that's watching him, and I see that gun in his hand, from the time my eye sees that hand start to move and come up, to the time my brain tells me, I see that gun starting to move, and my brain tells my hand to start bringing my gun up, is 3/4 of a second. From the time it took my eye to tell my brain and my brain to tell my hand to start moving, by the time my hand starts moving, that bullet has already been on its way to me. That's going to hit me 80% of the time from 10 yards from an inexperienced shooter. That's what research taught. So what are the implications of that if you're Mark Erickson running a law enforcement program, or Steve Borchardt or Kevin Torgerson responsible for a bunch of coppers that you want to see go home at the end of the night? It teaches you that they need to start making shoot, no shoot decisions based on a set of physical cues that are much more nuanced than what we were doing 25 years earlier. When I was in rookie school in the mid-'70s, that's what we called it, we did shoot, no shoot scenarios, and we literally, remember what we had in classrooms at the time? We had film strips. Now we had movie films, but then we also had the little gray projectors that had strips in them, then you could go frame by frame. And what we would do is we would sit there in a class, just like you're sitting here, and we would have 2 children's blocks in front of us, building blocks, and one would be red and one would be green. And they would be sitting with the red and the green pointed in the air. And they would show us film strips, frame by frame, of an event that was unfolding. You're an officer, you get called to a parking lot, there's a report of a kid with a gun in that parking lot, you pull up, and out from behind a car comes this 10-year-old child, and he has it, and then they flip that next screen up, and they're facing a gun, but in that brief second before they flipped it up, you had to flip over a block to show whether or not you were going to shoot or not shoot. That's how primitive our shoot, no shoot decision-making practice process was in 1975 and 1977. By 2001, we had simulator machines that would actually shoot back at you. So you could make those shoot, no shoot decisions in a real-life situation. So just a lot of change in the technology that happened over that period of time. But what Mark's going to start talking to you about now is what I left off on a second ago. The kind of research that now puts officers in a situation where they're trying to make decisions as to whether or not they should shoot or not shoot based on a series of verbal cues that might be short of actually seeing a weapon pointed at you. Now, as I've rambled over these last 15 minutes and not paid attention to my slides, can you bump backwards about 4 slides real quick, Mark? Back at 70, there you go. Somewhere on the bottom, next slide, please. Well, I can't recall, but back in the 70s, I thought I had put that information in. Down on the bottom, annual average of police deaths in the 80s, 191. In the 70s, it was like 225, and I guess
Yeah, it is. It was about
that
225.
didn't make things fly. Bump ahead to the 90s, 162 per year. So you can see the changes in techniques being taught are resulting in fewer officers being killed. Bump ahead, please. The 2000s, 166. 210 to 215, average 136. So it's about 100 officers a year improvement due to techniques from 1975 to 2010. There's been a price to pay for some of that. Because officers are making shoot, no shoot decisions on behavioral cues that are more heavily nuanced, there's some occasions where those nuances aren't proving out to be what they thought they were going to be, and people are ending up dead, and our communities are scratching their heads saying, why did the officer shoot? Now, there's some other research that's going on into how your brain works, and how your brain processes memories, and how your brain fills in blanks for things that it doesn't quite detect, and how what happens when you get in a deadly force situation, the physiological changes to your body in terms of respiration and heart rate, and what that does to your perception of what you're seeing as you're going through this event. Time for me to be quiet and let Mark take it.
God, he did a good job though, folks, you gotta admit. So there's physical and cognitive limitations regarding the people we're dealing with as an officers. We try to understand that. What the sheriff was talking about, they just most recently did a study in Canada, the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, and they use simulators like the sheriff was talking about. And the officers would respond, they would react to these simulators, there would be a screen up there that responded, and quite honestly, they got their heart rate up. They got their blood pressure up, okay? And with that, again, you get tunnel vision, auditory exclusion. Your cognitive abilities are limited. So the suspect had a weapon tucked in his belt for part of the scenario, and they could see that there. And it come to a part of the scenario, the suspect would bring their hands up. 80% of these veteran officers saw a gun that wasn't there in the scenario-based training. So that's just kind of enforces what the sheriff was saying. It affects us, and it's how we train people. Again, we talk about memory encounters where stress is involved. Physiological, cognitive limitations to officers' performance during deadly force situation or stressful situations. So a lot of this stuff I get from, Dr. Lewinsky, pressure points and control tactics. We talk about the autonomic nervous system. It controls, keeps our heart beating, keeps us breathing. We don't have to think about it. Within there is the sympathetic nervous system. So in very stressful situations, the sympathetic nervous system kicks in, and that gives us the power, the energy to flee, flight, or fight. So I don't know if we've got any deer hunters in here, but I want you to think about you're sitting down in a chair, you're warm, it's cold outside, and that great big buck walks by, and all of a sudden your heart and you're breathing hard. That's what the sympathetic nervous system. I want you to think about moms that are watching their kids growing up, and that crazy incident that scares the heck out of you. It takes your breath away. You're so afraid for your child. That's what we're talking about. That kicks in. So when that kicks in, guys, it affects us. Okay? It affects us. I think our abilities, that close proximity, unable to control that threat, the things that, I think it's the clues that kicks in that CNS. So we get tunnel vision. I got a lot of ways that it helps or affects our vision. And I guess, again, we had talked about auditory exclusion. And it affects our cognitive abilities. We got officer-involved shootings with vehicles. In a stressful situation, when a vehicle is coming at you, they call it looming. It appears to be going, it's bigger than it actually is. That's your appearance. That's the way it appears to you. And it actually appears to go faster than what it actually is. So many times, if you've got cameras out there, and then we got cameras in the squad cars, in Olmsted County Sheriff's Office, 360 outside the vehicle, 360 with inside the vehicle. Okay? That camera is going to show one thing, but it's not going to be the perception of that officer. That car is actually going to seem bigger, it's going to seem like it's going faster, and it's going to be in closer proximity to you. So many times it might be, from looking at a video, confusing why the officer reacted the way they did. So we're looking at those things in our training. So I talk about a little bit here. So what we would like is, where we react good, if we can control that, or if we put ourselves in a position so that the sympathetic nervous system doesn't kick into the point that our heart rate goes above 170 beats per minute. If we can be in a range at 115 to maybe 145, that's when we got good reaction time. We can react, our cognitive abilities aren't limited, and we're going to work good. So the way we control that as law officers is proper diet, taking care of ourselves physically. So actually, it's like the Army, be all you can be. We tell our people, you need good diet, you need to exercise, okay? Your mental health has to be good. That means you need a partner you can talk to. If you're a woman deputy, you need to be able to talk to your husband or your partner, whoever that might be. You need somebody you can deal with this. Because this baggage keeps building up, it's going to affect your cognitive abilities when you're reacting to a stressful event. The things that you see in law enforcement, you shouldn't have to see. You shouldn't have to see, and we see it. If we don't deal with it, it builds up, and we're going to have cognitive problems. We're going to have problems dealing with that stress. We're going to react to stress many times. And sometimes you can see it when you're having a bad day and all of a sudden you kick the dog. The dog really didn't do anything bad or that bad, but we kicked the dog. So, we all can kind of relate. I got a new lab puppy at home. She doesn't know what it means to be kicked or hit or anything like that. I holler at it, she runs up to me thinking she's going to get a treat. So, I talked about this a little bit already. It affects your short-term memory. All right, so think about tunnel vision. We got officers that will actually be in a shooting situation. Not too long ago, there was two St. Paul officers that were driving down an alley, and they were ambushed by somebody, and the one officer was hit. The other officer opened up his car door, rolled out of the car, and reacted to it, engaged them. Now that officer couldn't remember the gunfire. Couldn't remember hearing any gunfire. And then 6 months later at a gas station, a tire blew. And then it all came back to him. So our minds play, in stressful situations, our minds can play tricks on us.
Can I jump in on this one, Mike?
Sure can.
This is really key. Now that I've been out of business for 8 years and totally away from it since 2014, and I'm just citizen Borchardt now, I'm looking at some of these things a little differently than I did when I wore that uniform for 30-some years. And what's key about this and the science of how our brain works is we've known for years in our business that eyewitness testimony is some of the least reliable testimony out there. And every officer here can tell some stories about eyewitnesses to a situation later calling and recanting what they told the officer at the scene because suddenly they just couldn't remember it. Now, what happens here, when your respirations go through the roof and your pulse rate goes through the roof, you get narrowed vision in that deadly force situation where you feel that your life is in crisis. You can get, your focus becomes complete, but that doesn't mean your brain is going to remember everything that's going on. Your auditory system, your peripheral vision is continuing to receive information, but it may not be entering your conscious state. But that doesn't mean your brain isn't dealing with it. And so what might be happening over here might affect your memory, but you aren't going to remember it necessarily when you're later trying to think about what happened in what order. Well, I saw the gun, so-and-so said this, and then I saw a flash from over here. And that's why, and why is this key? Because that's why we're getting what appear to be conflicting stories out of officers. When you have 2 and 3 officers on a deadly force scene, and they've all had to engage, they all may be seeing the same thing, but the same information isn't necessarily penetrating into their consciousness in the same way. They may be, or the brain may actually create information to fill in blanks where it doesn't have information from the officer's senses. The brain may be supplying information from peripheral vision that the officer's not really aware of, that's affecting some of the decisions those officers make, because your hearing is going on 360 as you're in this situation. The threat is there, but your hearing is going on everywhere, and your peripheral vision is going on everywhere, or to the, at least to the front and sides, and it may be impacting what your brain is seeing. That's why we are seeing some of this disconnect in the media about what officers see. Sometimes it could be an officer flat out lying. An officer did something wrong, they know they did something wrong, and they're trying to cover their butt, and they're going to tell the biggest fib they ever told, so they don't have to end up going to jail or losing their job or what have you. But sometimes it's not that at all. Sometimes it is a physiological process about how your brain works, and that brain doesn't remember it. Right now, and why this is important is because how we design our policies. In our very own community right here, we have a commission made up of representatives of the community determining policy about how we are going to use body cam information once the officer has that body cam. Kevin will probably speak more to this later if you want to. And there is one school of thought that that officer shouldn't be able to see that body cam information while they're writing the report, because they're just going to write that report to be consistent with what the camera shows, right? And therefore, it'll help them cover up their misdeeds because they'll be able to lie with the assistance of that camera. Other way to look at that is that if you want accuracy out of that officer about what took place, it may be smarter to relying on what that camera says than just relying on what that officer's eyes saw and brain remembers that the eyes saw, because the brain acts funny when you're under deadly force kind of stress. That's the difficulty of what we're dealing with right now as we go through this period in the development of technology in the business. Those officers' memories may be a total fabrication that they're doing on purpose because they did something wrong. It may be the natural function of how our brain works in a highly stressful situation. One more piece I'll add before I turn it back to Mark is, as a society, we're just learning what to do with video. Video, so readily available, is brand new to us. Now, it doesn't seem brand new. We've been carrying smartphones for 3 or 4 years, right? We've been taking videos of everything for 3 or 4 years, right? But when my career goes back to 1975, it's really a short period in the last 3 or 4 years, and our legal system doesn't know what to do with it. Think of it in this context. We just watched the Super Bowl. When a receiver tries to catch the ball, and whether or not they had it when they landed on the ground, or there's a fumble, and whether or not the ground caused the fumble or it was coming out on the way down, what do the refs do? They go to the sidelines, and they've got the benefit of 5 or 6 different cameras for 5 or 6 different angles, and they put a hood over their head so they're not distracted, and they watch replay after replay from 5 or 6 different angles for 2 minutes, and they come out and render their life-threatening decision that, yes, he really did fumble. We put a ton of resources into determining whether or not that receiver really did fumble. What are we dealing with on these news events that you're seeing with officers involved shooting? We're dealing with one video from a cell phone from 50 yards away under difficult circumstances, jumping around and moving, and we think we know what we're seeing. Sometimes we do. Sometimes it's really close, and it's really accurate. But other times, It isn't. And so we have 10 seconds of video for an event that happened that took 3 minutes. So we're just learning as a society what to do with this video and how to treat it in our legal system. And we have a ways to go, and it's going to be messy. We're going to have more of this as these cases make their way through the court system and the court tries to figure out how we can deal with it. I haven't even touched on the video that we're going to get from drones and what the expectation of privacy is and how that can be affected by it. But in the meantime, we're going to wrongly convict some people because of video, or we're going to wrongly exonerate some people because of video, because we haven't learned how to use it in our criminal justice system yet.
And just to go along with that, I saw some, and I don't even know if it was a Super Bowl or another game, where they had a guest expert, a referee, who said they're going to overrule that call by the video. And they didn't. So he's their expert, guest expert, and he got it wrong after seeing the video. So, as Sheriff Borchardt said, it's very, very difficult, but we're going through. But I think it's going to make us better as officers. I think it's a good thing. I remember when we got recorders we were wearing in our pockets. So we were recording the conversations we were having with the public. I think it made us better officers. So I think the cameras will make us better officers, but again, with that, we got limitations with those cameras too. So it'll be interesting. So I've got a couple cases out there that I was looking at. One involved cases that were overturned because of DNA. Now, DNA is incredible. But in one case here, it talks about many of them are because of original convictions were because of eyewitness reports. In this other study, there was like 160 cases, and half of them, these people, their convictions were overturned. And it was because of an eyewitness report. So you think about it, people. The same things we're talking about that affects law enforcement affects our victims and witnesses. You think about some of the traumatic things that people are a part of, whether it be a violent rape or whatever it might be. Maybe they're witnessing a police shooting. Their sympathetic nervous system's kicked in too. Their perception might not quite be what reality is either, just as it might be for the officer. So it's a problem we have to address from kind of two ways, two angles. So it is difficult. And we kind of, Sheriff Borchardt talked about this, and quite honestly, that's the way we're training. So we do a basic firearms class at the college, and we're teaching our students to shoot. You know, when they go on, they get hired by some department, Olmsted County Sheriff's Office, at least 4 times a year they're going to go out and shoot. You know, you think about Olmsted County. Think of my 31 years. I never shot at anybody. Low activity, high risk. Any risk managers would tell you that's a bad deal. Low risk, you know, you just don't use the gun. But if you use it, you better be using it the right time, but you better hit what you're aiming at too. So we have it maybe, and we're doing it more. And I wanted to say the Olmsted County Sheriff's Department's doing a lot of this too, but scenario-based training so that we work on de-escalating the situation. Okay? But when it comes to a deadly force situation, you think of some of the triggers, close proximity to a threat, or it's a life and death situation, you are going to react and you are not going to think. Because he was saying, Dr. Bill Lewinsky found, we can do everything right and still lose. It's like going to Vegas. You can do everything right at Vegas, and you still got to get lucky or you're going to lose at blackjack. And it's the same thing we're looking at. We can approach that vehicle exactly the way we're supposed to. We can blade ourselves. We can keep our eye in the hands of the driver. And if they grab a gun and point it back at us, shoot at us, we still got to get lucky or we're going to get shot. And we We teach that to our officers, and we tell that to our officers. So we're making them hypervigilant. Now, if we make them hypervigilant, what's that do to their cognitive abilities? The stress. I mean, if they aren't taking care of that baggage when they're going home, they aren't talking about it, it's just going to build on them. So there's a lot that, as trainers, we got to look at regarding scenario-based training and how we do that. Here I have the reactionary curve. An officer is going to be half a second or more behind his actions unfold. The sheriff already talked about that. Many studies were done by Force Science Research that did that. They've done different ones. The sheriff talked to one about standing. They did another one where a guy was all time-stamped, digitally recorded. Student sitting in a chair. The officer comes up to the simulated open car window, and whenever the student wants to, they can take their gun and they point it back at the officers and shoot. The slowest student was faster than the fastest officer. So that's the type of information we're seeing. So it's complicated for law enforcement, and we're looking at this scientifically, in different ways, trying to figure out the best way to train our officers. But it is complicated. Thank goodness, it's only 1% of the time that we're dealing with it.
And here's the challenge, really quick. Every briefing, there's information coming across the briefing table about an officer shot someplace. Wherever they have the information about how it took place, they're sharing that, so that each officer is hitting the street each night, each day, with that information, the newest techniques, so they can be aware of it. Mark's making them aware of all of this research. And the upshot of that is we can be putting some very well-prepared, mentally prepared officers on the street that are scared to death. And so what's the first thing that happens when they walk up to their car and they see something happen quickly that's out of sync? All of those autonomic responses take place, and they take place right now, and suddenly that officer can be acting out of fear. So all of our best intentions to equip them with information, current information, results in putting them in a situation where they're making some decisions out of fear. So how do we balance that? That's a real challenge. We balance it by more training, more repetitions, more scenario-based training. What's the consistent thread through all of that? More time off the street and in the training activity, more officers having to train together in the training activity off the street, more officers involved as training officers, and the expense of facilities that go along with that. So everything I've just outlined has a dollar sign attached to it. And suddenly it takes 15 officers to do what we used to do with 10 officers, but we have to have this higher level of training with more repetitions so that the stressful responses become instinctive and not based on fear and stress. You were going to say something?
I was just going to say that goes a long way to explain that these multiple bullets into a person by an officer. Someone could be shot once or twice, but they've got like 15 holes in them.
Did you hear what she said? She said that goes a long way to explain why we see some of these cases where people are shot multiple times and officers shoot so many bullets in these circumstances. And that's a really key point, and I'm glad you brought that up, because there's two things that work there. Number one, that when you're in that high-stress situation and you're in that tunnel vision and you start shooting that gun, you're not counting the rounds. It's happening too fast. And you are responding instinctively, and study after study has shown that officers don't know how many rounds they've shot in that high-stress situation. Number two, research has shown that once the circumstances have been presented to an officer that justify them starting to shoot, if that stimulus suddenly shuts off, like the bad guy turns around, and the bad guy can turn around in less than half a second. So now their back is towards you and they're going away, and you suddenly don't have cause to shoot anymore. Psychologically, you can't stop. It takes so long for that information to get through your brain and tell your body to stop that you've dumped another 3-4 rounds into them while they're going the other way. and that's looked at as excessive force, and it looks like excessive force. But it may be the result of a physiological brain function and not an intent to use to use excessive force.
Yeah, that's a very good point. Very good point. The Supreme Court now is looking at, we didn't, for many years, we didn't have issues with, an officer was looking at, we can be sued civilly, administratively, we can be fired, and we can be trialed criminally. But quite honestly, forever, we were never tried criminally for our actions. We might lose our job, we might get sued, but now people are really calling for that officers be charged criminally. So that's kind of a change in our culture here in our society for their actions, and it might be something out of their control. Might be something out of their control. So, good points. I wanted to kind of leave some time, and I'm kind of on, I don't know how I did it, but I'm kind of on schedule because I want to leave about 15 minutes for questions. So just get through here. Memory, and the sheriff talked about this. It's most important to officers to be accurate in their memory because of the stressful situation. Seek certain key details you're just not going to remember. We tell officers that have been into a deadly force situation, a shooting situation, 2 sleep cycles, minimum 48 hours before you write a report. Your memory recall will be the best. So send them home, maybe write an outline, get some headings down, fill it in as the next 2 days go by, and you'll be able to your memory will be better, and you can look at it, and you can write a good report. Okay? I would suggest, and we don't do this, and I don't know if it would be appropriate because you got to weigh it both sides. Talking to your partners there will help you recall things. But it also could contaminate your memory. It could contaminate your memory. That's when we go to talk to victims. We want to talk to them right away before they talk to somebody else, and somebody else's memory becomes theirs. And that other person might not even saw it. So we want to talk to our victims and our witnesses right away. But officers, and they've been involved in a shooting, deadly force type situation, we send them home, and we should be anyway, give them two sleep cycles before they write a report. And it's up to the officers, or many times, the last time we had an officer involved shooting, the BCA did the investigation. And quite honestly, I don't recall if they did a recorded statement or a written statement. The officer before that was involved in a shooting situation. I remember they went, because he was shot too, they went to the hospital and they took a recorded statement from him. Now that takes somebody with some talent to have it in chronological order, for it to be clear, concise, have the information there. I don't know that I would trust myself to do that. I would like to do an outline and write a report. Sheriff?
Here's the conflict. If you haven't picked it up, we'll put a bow on it. That's what brain research tells us should be the practice. Now you can imagine in some of the high-profile cases that we've all been referring to that have happened in the last year and a half, if we told everybody, just sit down, relax, be a couple of days before the officer will write the report, and then we'll go through everything, we'll tell you what we think happened. What do you think the tolerance in our society for that is? At a time when we want information right now, we want to know how it happened, when it happened, and yet brain research is telling us best practice is this. This is where you get conflicts between the officers' unions, the officers' defense attorneys, and the people, as represented by the police chief, the sheriff, the people, us. So we haven't figured this stuff all out yet. So I'm not saying this to be defensive of officers or to find blame for anybody, but these are the conflicting forces at work that folks like Kevin and Mark teaching young cops have to try to navigate their way through.
Yes, sir.
Yeah, I'm 87. I can remember back about 1936 or 37, and that we had a restaurant, the Princess Cafe, And I had an uncle that was pretty husky, and he used to assault any kid that misbehaved. He'd assaulted them, and one time the police chief, one of the guys was a nephew of the police chief. And when he found out about it, he worked there. Of course, they don't do that.
No, we don't. Yeah, we don't do that anymore. But
and actually, maybe they should use some force like that. And also, the trouble is, like years ago, they had these Western movies, bang, 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 and we didn't take too much. I mean, we didn't. We probably used toy pistols, but we didn't aim to kill people. But now people see that on TV and everything, and I think that might be the reason why a lot of them are using guns. I mean, I don't know.
Well, he's talking about the TV and things like that. Quite honestly, Hollywood TVs, shows, movies has done a great injustice to law enforcement. You think of these shows they have on right now, CSI, Cops, same kind of thing. Those guys, I'm thinking, they are cops, and they're allowing this. Knowing that it's about entertaining. It's about selling time, making money. It's not about what's actually going on. And they've done a great injustice for law enforcement of what we actually can do. And how we do our job. At CSI, you go to if you're a juror and you're sitting up there, the prosecutor is going to ask you, do you watch any of these crime scene investigation shows? Do you understand? It's a TV show, it's for entertainment. Do you understand that law enforcement can't do the things that they show on those shows? Now, there's some things certainly we can do, but many things we can't do in an hour. We can't do it in an hour. So that TV hasn't done us any favors at all. Any favors at all. I think we're about, the last thing I put in here, as a society, we may be imposing restraints that are unrealistic and unscientific on our officers. And that's why I say that, because we need, talking about what Sheriff Borchardt said, we need time for scenario-based training. Okay? We need time we are much better now. Our officers get involved in shootings. We go get them counseling. Okay? When one of my partners got shot in the back, we had a critical incident debriefing. That was huge for my mental health. It didn't hurt for his wife to come up and give me a big hug and say, "It's not your fault, Mark." You know, that helped quite a bit. But we didn't used to do that. We're doing that now. There's a lot of things we're doing in law enforcement that are making us better. But we're evolving. And culturally, we're different throughout the country. Rochester, Olmsted County are going to do things different than maybe Minneapolis. Minneapolis are going to do things different than Chicago. Chicago's going to do things different than New York. Culturally, we're all evolving, I think, in law enforcement, maybe at a different pace. And a lot of it has to do with our history. So we're trying. Be patient with us, but I would suggest not too patient. Don't be, that part of what's great about our country is the right to protest. You had a question?
Yeah, my name is Ray Phelps-Bowman. In looking at the continuum of force, you're talking about the presence of a uniformed officer can make a difference, and I believe that's true. The uniform does make a difference, and so my question is, when you have a SWAT team, the SWAT teams that I see on TV, and I've not seen a Rochester one, in real life, are all dressed like soldiers. I could not tell them from a soldier. They wear camouflage uniforms. They look like soldiers, and it does concern me that the uniform makes a difference, and I'm concerned about the militarization of the response of the SWAT team as opposed to being police, maybe seeing themselves as military because they look like they're military. So that's how I react. Could you explain why SWAT teams, if I'm correct,
Yep.
SWAT teams are dressed that way?
And that's fair, and that's a good question, and it's good to point that out. A lot of people, that's a lot of people's perception. And if you take a look at our society, they really weigh it heavily if they're going to bring in the National Guard or reserves or something like that. And it's not about, they're not a police force. Our government is very firm about that. But I was on that SWAT team or ERU team. So was the sheriff. Much of those things, the clothes that we dress, is because of what's expected of us. It's not to give that impression that we're a military type organization. It's just that the equipment that we're carrying, the expectations. Now, I had these black fatigue pants that I'd wear, and they have pockets, and they were just easy to move in also, and I'd have equipment. I might have chemical agent in one pocket. I always carried a mirror that was on a old car antenna that I could pull out. So if I'm searching a room, I could search around the corner. So it has more about the equipment and things like that, and not necessarily we're trying to, I don't believe, to give an impression that we're part of the military. But with, think about their active shooter. We used to respond with handguns and a shotgun, and now we have rifles. Because many times we're shooting down a long highway to engage somebody that could be 50, 60 yards away, that the weapons are inappropriate. Sheriff, you had something?
I'd like to take a shot at that one also. What Mark's been saying is that, and he doesn't need me to say it, but I'll sum it up by saying it this way. A lot of what that uniform is for the tactical application of that set of clothing. Does it need to look that way? That's a valid question. Need they be military? That's a little tougher question. Because your officer on the street, we expect to be able to deal with a lost child, the run-over puppy dog, the runaway 16-year-old girl, the abused 16-year-old girl, and potentially the terrorism event that has been carried off with military precision. And it may be the same officers. And they need to dress in a way that's sensitive to the expectations of our community. So it is a wide spectrum of duties that we're expecting out of these folks. The first people on the scene at the World Trade Center wasn't the military. It was New York PD. The first people on the scene at the Pentagon were not military. It was Arlington County Sheriff's deputies. And if something happens in Rochester, Minnesota, or in Minneapolis, it's going to be deputies or police officers. Those first officers are going to look like Kevin looks today. Very quickly, they're going to be a more tactically equipped group. They are going to be thinking more like soldiers in a tactical event in that situation. So the answer to your question is you're absolutely right. We have to be really sensitive to the appearance of the overuse of a militaristic-looking approach, while at the same time understanding that we expect our officers to be able to apply a militaristic approach on occasion in some kind of events. So it's a tough balancing act.
Go ahead, sir.
Mark, you mentioned a little bit about the situation of an active shooting situation. Would you comment a little bit about what I think is happening, and that is that early engagement is now being taught? Is that correct?
Yes.
Well, how in the world can you, as a training officer, train for that? How do you train them to react going into a situation like that?
You know, part of it is the people that go into law enforcement. We go in there to help people, truly. People go into law enforcement not to arrest people, give them tickets, throw them in jail. They go into law enforcement because they want to help people. And you think of the different, and you're fighting for that underdog. You think about if you had an active shooter in a school, I don't know one officer that wouldn't grab his rifle and go in there by himself, knowing they would put their lives in danger. I don't know one that wouldn't. I mean, if we've taken that risk, and I try to make my students aware of that signing up to do the job, you got to know that you're putting yourself in that position that you're going to have to take that risk one day. It's like when you get that Minnesota driver's license and you get stopped, officer says, let me see your Minnesota driver's license. You're driving a vehicle. You have to show them your driver's license. You signed up for that when you got your license. That's a law enforcement. You signed up to do that job. Now, we work about tactics, and I know some officers probably aren't crazy. Maybe they want to wait for that one more person or something like that. But that's our mission. That's our charge, to protect the people we're serving. Lieutenant Colonel David Grossman says, we're the sheepdog. The sheepdog won't hurt the lambs. It won't hurt the citizens. It viciously attacked the wolf. So that's kind of who we are. And it's on us to protect the citizens. And if you put your life at risk, knowing going in there. Yeah, that's what it is. And it's not easy. It's not easy sometimes for your family, I would suggest. Many of us in law enforcement don't get enough sense to think about it, but it's hard on our families. Any other questions?
When you're dealing with a situation where no one's life is in danger and their suspect is fleeing, what is the guidance on deadly force?
Okay, it really depends on what's going on, but specifically, if in a terrorist event, throw it to a terrorist event, if we see somebody with a rifle and they're going into the male clinic and they're going to go in and shoot as many people as they can, we don't have to wait for them to get in there and start shooting. I don't have to say stop or shoot. I don't have to wait for them to turn around. I'll shoot them as many times as I can in the back to stop them. So it depends on the event specifically what the purpose is. Okay, we can use deadly force to protect ourselves from another great bodily harm or death, but in a situation like that, that's what we're doing.
Let me take a crack at that also. He's absolutely right. And what I would add is that under the deadly force statute, if you have reason to believe that person is in the process of, or is about to use deadly force or cause great bodily harm or death to another person, then you have justification for using deadly force to stop them if that's what it takes. It doesn't mean you have to jump immediately to a deadly force option, but you can. So that person, that fictitious person that was going away from you, that right now at this moment doesn't appear to be a threat to anybody, if you are going to shoot them, you had better be able to articulate why you thought that them getting away was going to potentially lead to them exercising deadly force or great bodily harm against somebody else. And that can sometimes be done depending upon what the circumstances are that you just witnessed. But you have to be able to articulate that to a reasonable person's standard. And what is that standard? That standard is a reasonable person engaged in the same event would come to the same conclusion that you've come to. So that's what you need to be able to articulate. It can be justifiable, but you need to be able to process that information very quickly and be able to explain. You shot him because circumstances clearly indicated to you that if they got away, they were going to use the deadly force on somebody else that they had just used right here. That's the answer to that.
Well, I've certainly been unlike the 995, well, most of the other people I've met, but it just seems to me the media does a huge disservice because they're all taking a snapshot, and that's it. They don't have the ability to understand the scientific things that you've explained to us tonight.
The media, well, remember the media, they're there to sell print. They're there to sell commercials. They're there to make money. The media, though, by far, are very kind to law enforcement. Okay, but in certain situations where we have activities like that is going to sell airtime, and I mean, they're going to be a part of it, they're going to do it. But
I guess I'm talking about the ones that the controversial ones that we I think they are very good to you on the everyday ones. But the one where the guy was shot 16 times in Chicago, you know, I think you've explained tonight why that potentially happened. I don't know. I mean, but look at that video and look at that guy being laying on the pavement being shot is not really very friendly.
No, and I don't blame the media for that. That dash cam, that came from a squad car.
Yeah.
Dash cam video. That through data privacy, through the public to right to know, they got that and they put that out there. I have questions about that shooting. Believe me, I want to know about that, and I'm going to wait patiently for an outcome of the investigation. But I, as an instructor, you know, past law enforcement, I have a lot of questions regarding that. So I want to know more about that. And so, but really, truly, the media is there to show the public, I mean, what we're doing. Besides to sell print and airtime or whatever, you know, they fancy themselves as a checks and balance to our government system. And they do, too. I mean, it's difficult, and you probably won't hear me say this around in the table where we're having cups of coffee with a bunch of cops, but that's reality.
A couple things that I would add. First of all, very often the media doesn't know. They don't understand. We don't teach a lot of the concepts that we talked about here in school. We don't teach them in civics class. We don't teach about the standards of proof. We don't teach them the difference between reasonable suspicion and probable cause and what levels of proof there are in the courtroom, preponderance of the evidence, proof beyond a reasonable doubt. People don't come out of high school with an understanding of what those concepts are. If they're never on the jury, they don't do those concepts. And that goes for our media too. So often they don't know how to report these things. Number two, try to mop up some things that may be loose ends. All the things we talk about relative to officers and the cognitive reaction to a deadly force situation is true for all the witnesses that are watching it too. So when a witness gives what appears to be an erroneous statement, it may be real easy to say they're lying. Or that might be what they saw, or what they think they saw. So we don't quite know how to deal with that in society either, because we're learning about some of those things. So one of the reasons I thought that this could be a helpful class for those of you that came out on a cold night in February was because we don't teach this, and because you don't get the opportunity to have this kind of reporting that explains this kind of thing. So hopefully it's been helpful in that regard. The other thing I would add, just real quickly, is that the Constitution doesn't protect you guys from each other. It protects us from those guys that are wearing the uniform, from the government. Those guys have the authority to exercise the law against us because we voluntarily give it to us. The God voluntarily give it to them. That is the theoretical notion behind our Constitution. We all have individual power in our liberty under this Constitution. We have determined as a society that we need to have a police force to keep the peace amongst us because we can't do it as a group of vigilantes. So we have each figuratively or theoretically given a little piece of our power under that Constitution to him and said, you can use that power against me to restrict my liberty based on, of course, redress and review and on the proper cause and what have you and all that. But I am giving you. So the point of this talk is that he has authority by virtue of the statutes, but he has authority by virtue of what we have collectively given him to use against us. That demands a high standard out of him and the people he employs to use that power of taking away our liberty against us. And that's why it's entirely appropriate that we hold our law enforcement and our government to a high standard of executing that. It's also appropriate that we do it wisely and with understanding for the reality of the challenge that they've accepted on our behalf. And so that's the nut to the whole thing. And we're an evolving society. We're learning how to do that with the technology that's coming to bear and it's changing our lives every day. But it is appropriate. Some of this that you've seen, particularly those of you that participate in social media, have seen these national cases degenerate into pro-cop or anti-cop, or it's more nuanced than that. And we have to bring a more sophisticated response to that. And woe be to the law enforcement leader that is looking at that situation and just strictly taking a pro or con approach, because it is their sworn duty to figure out how to lead their people in a way that makes them smarter in these tactical situations than the people that are causing the problem. Got to be smarter than. And so that's the challenge Kevin's accepted. That's a big, high bar to me.